Hi there, I hope you're having a wonderful day. I am Doug. I wrote The Guardsman under the pen name of R.G. Taark. We are on Book 3, Wrath and Retribution. That's this one right here. We are on episode 32, chapters 76 through 77. When you get a chance, please sit back, relax, and enjoy. And then when it's all over, leave yourself a nice comment. Love to hear from you. Likes and subscribes help too. If you are really interested, should be a link down at the bottom if you want to get your own copy. Please enjoy.
The Guardsman, Book 3, Wrath and Retribution. Episode 32, Chapters 76 through 77. Chapter 76. Persephone fiddled at her desk, fussing with several open documents at the same time, and a stack of hard-used and brutally crossed-off pages on a frustratingly unsuccessful list of failed passwords. She flipped her thumb under her index finger, sending her pen flipping through the air, forgotten, until its thin sound clattered to the top of the hard copy as she turned back to the touch-screen desktop where she could scroll through her documents. It was frustrating and time-consuming work like none she had ever encountered. Even longhand on paper math lessons used as time filler during her childhood groundings weren't as frustrating and pointlessly time-consuming as this process of trying to guess Casimir's passwords. The bastard had somehow managed to hard-code some sort of worm into the basic threads of the operating system programming code for everything on his machine. The vitamin D deficient programmer types who had spent many frustrating hours trying to explain to her the details of the hows and whats of this coding. Their chatter had done nothing but confuse her more and cause her eyes to glaze. They had finally thrown their hands up in frustration and described the process as simply as they could imagine settling on a simple book analogy for digital storage. They told her that basically what he'd done, or had done for him, was to create a book with a lock, and that if the lock was forced open the paper pages themselves would burn, not just the text. When she asked how he'd managed to set up the hard drive to explode, they had sighed and groaned together. That reaction had only frustrated her even more. One of the boy geniuses had practically shouted at her that the cover of the book wouldn't burn. Just the outsides of the pages and information stored on those pages would burn. It will leave pristinely blank pages after it burned. That she'd understood. She was good at sending sneaky little messages to Samson with her existing toys. She had no experience with actually programming them from scratch, though. And that was now her problem. She knew how to use it, not create it. Her next heartfelt groan had been more of agreed frustration than frustration with her messengers. They had been socially adept enough to realize that their new boss had finally understood their dilemma. She'd thought she was a genius when she'd asked them, well, when a book is printed, there is a tiny indentation where the letters and ink are pressed into the page. We can let it burn, and then pull the letters of those indentations. That feeling was squashed when they all collectively cringed and did some sort of groan while they pinched or rubbed their eyes. She was told emphatically that not only was all the stored data written into the worm, but that as it dissolved itself, it would rewrite into those sectors again and again in fractal gibberish. That would not only cover the entire physical space of the storage, but would then consume itself and disappear forever. So even the fractal pattern couldn't be analyzed. She got frustrated and asked if they could start its burn, then kill the power to the device, stop the progression, and then restart the power and read what was left. Unfortunately, the worm's designers had thought of that too. The worm started from its beginning every time that they had cloned the drive and attempted to do just that. It was like the worm was at the very center and burned everything from the outside in, finally consuming itself. Curious and void of frustration, she'd asked, "How do you clone the storage without starting the password protection?" The answer was a relief and thankfully short, They could mirror the drive all day without logging into it. They just couldn't read anything saved there. That was how they'd been able to experiment with the worm's actions for their report. The worm acted as password encryption. The first thing it did was to only allow input of 3 password attempts before it burned the drive clean. The password input bar itself was 48 characters long, so with the letters of the alphabet plus special characters and capitals, there was something on the order of 4 to the e power of 180 possible answer combinations for a random number generator to work through. To complicate things, with spaces and blanks included even more. Even with the 3 password attempts available, they still had to work through a number with 180 zeros divided by 3 attempts per drive. Each drive would have to be replaced manually since they were set up to be primary drives in a standalone machine. They had found out the hard way that if the configuration of the machine was wrong, the drive would consume itself on power-up. They had counted themselves lucky that they had feared the worst and mirrored the drive first before beginning any experimentation. Once the first mirror had consumed itself, they quickly made 5 more copies of the original. Then they stored the original in a safe, set aside the 5 backups, and only copied from one of those at a time. Finally, they always ensured that they had at least 5 of the devilish drives under separate lock and key. They had already had one bumbling technician scrub one of their drives. Fortunately, not the original, but one they had to replace, nonetheless. He had apparently sent some little memo about accidentally working on the wrong drive. The oddity of the situation was that when the security detail had picked him up, the technician had disappeared en route to detention through the secured internal areas of the intelligence section where there were no video recordings. The frustrating paradox that they now needed secured cameras in their supposedly secured areas, secured by their own internal security and external security cordon, was only solved by the non-lethal force used to drug and incapacitate the 2 escorting security personnel. The technician was gone and hadn't been spotted on any surveillance for more than 3 weeks. The guards were not absolved because the drugging could have been willingly administered and just been covered, to keep them in place within the organization. It also didn't convict them either, since the compound used was fast-acting and fired through a dart, meaning they couldn't have stabbed each other, or they would have fallen much closer together and with arms entangled. It was a frustrating state of affairs. They couldn't trust anyone in this rat's nest of trained spies, trained to hide loyalties in the process of their indoctrination, so it was near impossible to tell the loyal from the not. It was also next to impossible to know who among them still had passive ties to those who had once been co-workers and colleagues, but had flipped to Casimir. Those honest ones with ties to the defectors or informants could be reporting as usual to enemy informants, and they'd never know that they were being played by the dishonest ones. Dozens had defected outright on the first day after Casimir made his break from the hegemony. But because of the compartmentalized nature of their spy business, no one really knew who the true defectors were. She couldn't very well publish the names, faces, and personnel files of those known traitors. Or should she? It was still a powerful tool to keep the other side guessing about who was known to have defected versus who may have still been working for them on legitimate assignments. She couldn't have known if she had blacklisted someone on a legitimate operation that was just scheduled to depart that day. Then again, since those operations were scheduled by an organization run by Casimir, she couldn't be sure that those agents weren't dispatched as part of his plan, or as decoys after the fact when the few really bad actors realized that they were in trouble and had to run. Or were they ordered to run so Casimir could use their skills later in another variation of his coup? Or were honest operatives sent to run by the dishonest, purely to cover the tracks of the dishonest with false trails for her to follow? Thinking about all that twisted logic gave her a headache. It was a terrible realization that she would rather give herself a headache trying to interpret and second-guess the bag of snakes that was Casimir's mind, listening to her computer experts. They had burned through all the lists of the top 100 most commonly used passwords in the first week. That page on their attempted password list had long ago been folded to the back of the abused mini-novel that they used to keep track of the passwords they had tried. They had tried every variation of Casimir's name, initials, and pet names during the second and third weeks. They had then moved on to the unlikely possibility that a narcissist like Casimir had combined variations of Casimir and Diantha's names, to no result. They had burned yet another week and a fantastically large number of mirrored drives. Fortunately, by that time they were getting better at replacing the drives and setting up the test machine, well-now machines, for the next attempts. They weren't quite to the point of frustration where they would allow a random number generator to go to work for them, but they were close. The technicians just didn't want to sit there all day in the reversed role where the computer was clicking on them and telling them what to do, instead of them clicking on the computer telling it what to do, as was the natural order of things in their minds. They had made that point clear. In what she was learning was their uniquely technical dark humor. Persephone flicked her finger along her expansive touchscreen desktop, flipping through life-size digital pages of reports with simple flicks of her finger. She had settled into a routine to keep herself sane between playing password roulette. She would read 10 pages from their internal security operations reports. She would select the next document over and read 10 to 20 pages of the hegemony's external threat assessment. After those pages were read, she would check her messages and answer them as quickly as possible. Finally, she would write down a new potential password, if she could think of one. It wasn't much, but it was a routine that kept her marginally sane. To her empty office, she groused to herself, "You'd think that after hundreds of drives we've been through we could guess one password. I need to figure out how to get inside Casimir's head. I need to see through his eyes." She leaned back in her chair with a heavy sigh and rubbed her eyes. She caught her loose hair and pushed her thumbs back over her ears, where her fingers stayed rubbing her stress-tightened neck. She spoke to her empty office. "Casimir, where are you? What are you doing? What are you planning? How did you make these decisions and come to where we are now?" Staring at the ceiling now, she wondered. "When I can see through your eyes and see the world as you see it, I'll be able to know. I need to see the world as you see it. What is your motivation for what you've done? Lust for power and position? Or are you after revenge? Or both? And why your father? Why Diantha? Was she in your way? Did she oppose you? Did she threaten you even? What did she do to anger you so much? Or were you just being the spoiled, immoral child you are and lashing out at the first thing you could break? How do I get inside a head like that? I have more questions than starting points. I need your perspective first. We see the same world, but we see it so differently. I can't be me when I play these decisions through your eyes, because you play through your eyes. I need to understand the world as you see the world. I must put my head into yours, and then use your eyes." Running her hands down her face in frustration, Persephone felt her fingers accidentally pull clumps and strands of her hair forward and into a tangled mess over her face. At the moment she couldn't care about hair. "I knew you my whole life, but I never even met you, Casimir. How long have you been hiding what you were working on?" Her eyes closed as she scratched ineffectually at her forehead, hoping to scratch the aching mass she had lodged back behind her eyes. "All those months ago, Daddy said that he suspected this has been going on for a very long time. Has this all been you and our departed relative? What made Uncle Dear so frustrated and desperate to end this game that he made such an amateurish mistake as to dispatch Alexios from his own shoulder to come to kill me. I can't delude myself and think that for a second he sent Alexios after Samson. Alexios must have just taken the initiative, being the blunt instrument that he is, or was, to go after Samson and solve that personal grudge. He was arrogant enough to assume he could blow through Samson and come straight to me and finish the job. He had that mesh under his skin so he couldn't be cut. So, because of that, he felt confident he could win against Samson and his sword. He took pleasure in the assignment, in that he got the chance to kill Samson first, and then clear up with me. Alexios should have taken me first, and then dealt with Samson. He would have accomplished his mission then. His personal pride got in the way of his mission, though, which spared me. Persephone pinched her nose and gently rubbed the edge of her throbbing eyes. She asked the stale air above her desk, "How long had he been working for this? How long have you been working on this, uncle? Or was this Casimir's idea? Or was Casimir brought into his father's plot for advancement once it was already underway, and Uncle Idiot was sure of his boy Casimir's loyalties and caustic nature?" Persephone blurted to herself, "Gods below, I'm hungry." Persephone groaned in irritation as she forced herself back into a stretch and heard her shoulders and back actually pop repeatedly up and down their length under the strain. It was physically painful to move so much of her body that had been so still and stressed for so long. Her irritated groan turned into a pain-filled grunt as the last of her reach was fully extended, and she could feel a tingling pain even down to her toes. She wanted to cry, but she was too damn tired and frustrated to muster the energy required. Her hands flopped boneless to the arms of her chair as she leaned back on uncomfortably straight legs. What do I know about Casimir's history and personality type? I know he served as a soldier with acceptable distinction. I know he was always standoffish and never wanted to play with or be around me as a child or later when I was growing up. I know he beat Diantha to an inch of her life and left her to die in their bedroom. I know he and his father worked together from time to time. I know Casimir was very smart, but never applied himself in any way that resulted in results. No, that's wrong. There were results. Frustrated again, she clamped her teeth tight before relaxing and beginning again. We just never saw what he was producing. He was vicious. He was angry. He kept himself distant, but always at the center of the world. All the while not relating on an intimate personal level. He maintained all the useful associations required to gain and hold power in our corporation, and within the hegemony itself. He understood trading favors and interests among powerful and important people, narcissistic people, and people just like himself. Damn. Persephone groaned and pressed her palms to her eyes. Damn and double damn. He's a narcissistic prick just like the rest of these paper-deep sycophants who've ghosted and hounded around the palace my whole life. The world revolves around him. Because it revolves around him, the people in it and around him are expendable. He was good at this intelligence office stuff for a reason. He looked at everyone as his assets. Items to play with, position, use up, sacrifice, and discard. He is just like any number of the million immoral pricks we have on this world who call themselves COs. All they are out for is their next raise, bonus, and quarterly profit report. I'm Casimir. The world revolves around me. I don't need that skinny knock-kneed cousin Persephone around. She is an obstacle in between me and becoming the true center to the universe. I know that prick is a narcissistic jerk, so the world revolves around him and him only. When things go wrong for narcissists, they either lash out and destroy what has upset them, or they implode and collapse into depression, and there's no way in the great black expanse of stars he would ever collapse. He'd die first. Damn, no. He wouldn't be in a position to fail or succeed. His father would have been in his way as a senior member of Casimir's family branch with more voting shares than Casimir. She sat bolt upright and asked, would he have killed his own father? Sacrificed Uncle Thanatios to his ambitions too? Persephone folded forward in her chair, her bending legs pulling its smooth roll to under her desk as she palmed her eyes. She was rehashing things for the 1,000th time and was so tired she didn't even know if she'd said them before. The thoughts were new, or if she was just presenting them in different orders and seeing new things as she sat cradling her head at the apex of her arms. No, he couldn't have. Wait, yes, he could have. My mother said that Casimir said some nasty things while Samson and I were on the run. Therefore, she said she banished him from the table and social events until he learned manners. He was allowed to return and transgressed again almost immediately, and was exiled from the table a second time. That second time was when Alexios showed up at Vlad's during the interview. Thanatios was there, alone, more or less. Casimir never showed an iota of interest in anything to do with pop culture or vid broadcasting. He hated it and wouldn't even allow it to be played in his house. He probably knew I'd be getting interviewed that night, or suspected at least. But because to his eye I'm such a bother and blight, he could not have allowed my voice in his home during the interview. His father was on the vid, the state dinner vid that Vlad turned on to goad Samson for the fun of it. Casimir wouldn't have known that we were being watched by his co-conspirator, or that we were watching Uncle Thanatios. He couldn't have known. Persephone actually rapped her knuckles and then opened her palms several times on the back of her head as she nearly shouted, "Damn, damn, damn! Why didn't I see it before?" The bastard came into work the day after like normal. He had no reason to think it wasn't a normal day. Her hands started flying in time with her rapid one-sided conversation as she diagrammed everything before her own eyes, moving from finger to finger, for each point. Daddy said when he picked us up after Alexios that Casimir came into work and then made an excuse and left. Then Ma goes over to their place and Diantha is almost dead. Casimir came in. He saw the vid of his father, since Uncle Thanatios must have been on every screen in this place. He got furious that his co-conspirator could be so damn stupid, not to order it, but to get caught ordering it. Casimir blew out of here in a rage because years of work and patience were blown by what Casimir would consider the junior partner in their relationship's inept move. To Casimir, Thanatios was just a necessary tool to be used until completion, before being discarded at his own leisure. Correction, Persephone, discarded at Casimir's leisure. There is no way that a colossal prick like Casimir would ever allow someone like Thanatios to sit long between himself and his goal of ruling the hegemony. That has to have been his goal. He just couldn't have settled for anything else. Her hands exploded up and out in front of her chest to emphasize her point. He had to be at the center of the universe. He would never have cared about whoever was plowed under between himself and his goal. He's a psychopathic narcissist. To him, he is the only person in the world, in the whole universe, who matters. He was so close, and to see all that stripped away must have been infuriating. A heavy, heartfelt sigh taxed the absolute last of Persephone's emotional reserves. She spoke quietly, but could hear the very faint echo of her own voice in her sterile office. The walls were completely barren after all of Casimir's crap had been searched, stripped out, and disposed of. She spoke full of fatigue. Damn, and Diantha was just there at home starting her day when Casimir showed up with that storm behind him. Poor Diantha. She pressed her shaking hand to her forehead over her eyes and muttered, "I need to find time to get down to see you. You are way too sweet to deserve what that bastard did to you. No one deserves that. What a monster." The annoying hour chirp from her comm pinged from her pocket. It wasn't really loud. It wasn't really a chirp. It wasn't even annoying. It was just a little tick sound that she naturally drowned out during her day and silenced at night when she turned off and plugged the thing in to recharge. She dug into her pocket and wrenched the thing from the tangled cloth. As she sat immobile, incapable or unwilling to move so far as to lift her bottom from the chair, she woke up the device and cringed at the 37 missed calls and messages. She audibly groaned at the device as it scrolled a minute past 2 in the morning. Persephone growled at herself, "Oh, what in the hell am I doing to myself?" She discarded the device with a flip of her hand, sending it spinning out over and crashing onto her desktop. It marred her work, but she didn't care. She had to close it all anyway. She stood for the first time in more hours than she could count, pressing her left hand painfully into her screaming kidney and lower back. Her right hand swiped the opened reports off to the side of her screen, storing them in standby mode. They would update all night long as developments were posted, the various sections highlighting new material automatically. It was an executive's worst nightmare. It was a document that could be read in full, and literally, in the time it took to look away to an aide handing you a cup of coffee, the document could update telling you that you needed to go back and read something else. Thankfully, many years before Samson had shown her how to disable that function so that it wouldn't update until you stored it or told the program you wanted to incorporate the updates to the various chapters. She was so tired she couldn't even spare a smile for Samson as she lurched through the terminal's shutdown and security procedures. She dropped her annoying comm back into her pocket, without even looking at all the messages that had piled up. A yawn ripped its way out of her mouth as her eyes clamped shut and her head trembled slightly back and forth with fatigue. She dropped the hand she didn't even remember raising to cover her mouth as she stepped around her terminal towards the door. She was shocked at how fast the yawns and fatigue were settling in after that last manic burst of energy had passed. She shuddered through another yawn as her feet stumbled automatically to the door. She didn't even hear it open, but was immediately greeted from her right shoulder by the crisp Guardsman greeting. "Ma'am, the High Commander tried to reach you. I informed him that you were working, and your privacy settings were on, and you were not receiving calls." She hadn't even heard him snap to attention as she exited her sealed office. She sighed, but didn't really care about the answer when she asked, "What am I walking into, William?" Guardsman William Rasmussen was actually her height, but built like a block of iron. He finally returned to duty after many months in therapy to rebuild his eyes after the assassination attempt on Persephone that had prompted her to flee. Nerve damage always took the longest to repair and had to be done very slowly. By the time Bryce had caught up with them in their flight from pursuit, they had started moving so fast that there was no way for him to have reached them, even if his eyes had been fully rebuilt at the time. The imperturbable Guardsman Rasmussen shrugged slightly. "He's fit to be tied, ma'am. General officers don't generally appreciate being told to go pound sand by lowly majors like me." She sighed. "Leave my husband to me, William." She looked around the depleted outer offices at the quiet bustle of the night shift and asked, "Where's Bryce?" William snapped. "On the way, ma'am. I sent him to retrieve a bite to eat for you." She sighed tiredly as she started walking on autopilot. "It's a little late to be eating. I need to just go to sleep and I'll be fine." Her Guardsman snapped. "Bullshit, ma'am. that stopped her in her tracks as she looked back emotionally drained but trapped between confusion and anger. He demanded, "You need to eat. The last time you ate was breakfast at 06 this morning. Correction, last morning, and you've had nothing but coffee and air since. You'll eat or I'll force feed you." She started getting pissed off, felt her eye twitch and her jaw clench. She rasped, "You will do nothing of the kind, Major. I swear I will." His raised hand and obstinately shaking head stopped her cold. "Ma'am, it's my duty to see you safe and healthy. You can bitch and moan about it all you like. I serve the hegemony first, our civilian CEO who cuts my checks second, and High Commander third. There is no command authority between me and those three who you can sway. The first I serve to my own best judgment, so there's no grounds for argument there. The last two will likely agree with my side of the matter. You see the three of us, well, we're all trained the same." Persephone actually felt her teeth clamp and her eyes narrow preparing. Something had her brain not been mush from the 20-hour day she'd worked. The irritating man said, "Thank you," to her face. The cracking, slapping sound to her left drew her eyes to his outstretched right hand, holding a foot-long deli paper-wrapped sandwich of some kind. Her eyes focused on it, and her stomach betrayed her with a firm, growling rumble. She knew he heard that rumble because his eyes twitched down and his lips twitched up in a minuscule smile. Bryce replied crisply but quietly, "Yes, sir." Ham, cheese, salami with yucky vegetables, and green things too. The Major spoke, still looking straight at her. "Captain, inform the High Commander that we are on the way." The Major dangled the sandwich in front of her, while Bryce spoke quietly into his comm unit. "Ma'am, you can eat on the way." Her hand slapped down onto the sandwich. She attempted an angry scowl, but her stomach spoke to them all again, killing her credibility. "I should just go back into my office and lock the door, and make you stand out here all night." The dour Major actually twitched the corner of his mouth in a suppressed smile, before calmly informing her, "Ma'am, your office has no windows, and the vents are too small for exfiltration. That would leave me content in the knowledge that you were safely and exactly where I'd left you, and not rappelling out a bathroom window to disappear into the wilds unsupervised." She took a moment to catch his reference to her first escape from his charge. She felt her eyes open and the start of a drawn breath to snap at him. He was too quick for her and snapped. Again, that is. Before she could recover, he crisply did a right face and started to march down the quiet night shift occupying the warren of offices, in the section outside of her area. Frustrated, she ripped open the white paper at one end of the sandwich. She tried to fold the paper carefully while she walked, but her hands shook too much with each step and the overwhelming fatigue. Instead, she just gnawed at the open end, chewing between steps and peeling more of the wrapper back as she kept walking and more of the sandwich disappeared. She heard a growl in her throat when she reached the end and discovered there was no more of the sandwich left. Before she could fold the wrapper and slide the crumbs into her mouth, Bryce stepped forward into the side of her vision and in his irritatingly cheerful voice said, "I'm glad you liked it, my lady. It's good to see you actually eat something." Guardsman Rasmussen interrupted him, from over his shoulder to the front, "Captain, shut your noise hole and leave her alone. The lady has had a long day." Bryce fell back with a levelly neutral, "Yes, sir." She heard a door open quietly as Guardsman Rasmussen stepped abruptly aside. "Ma'am." She looked around and realized that she was in her room already. She smiled wanly. It was all she could manage as tired as she was, and stepped into the darkened room. The door closed behind her, choking off all the light from the hall, and she heard the door's magnetic locks engage. Her body shook in protest fatigue as she looked at the desk and Samson, still awake, in uniform, framed in light from the desk, and working on his own stack of endless paperwork. She covered the 5 steps to him and stroked his hand with her thumb. He'd obviously heard the door open, close, and then lock. His opposite fingers flicked over the hard-wired desk controls, shutting everything down. She mumbled, "Sorry I'm so late. I was buried and lost track of time," before he stood and allowed her to pull him to her. She corrected their bed. She walked her knees over the bed and flopped sideways onto the pillow. He fell in behind her, both on top of the spread and fully dressed. He spoke quietly into her hair. "Don't worry, I had the same today. I just got tired of people staying at work because I was there, so I sent them home and brought everything here." She sighed tiredly as her only response. She had less than 3.5 hours before she had to wake up again and do it all over again. Chapter 77. The weeks were finally settling into some semblance of routine for Bryce. Miss Persephone was still freaking out and working obscene hours, but that was manageable with the 2 of them pulling shifts between themselves on her security detail. All they had to do was flit back and forth between each other on 2-hour shifts throughout the day. They could manage anything from working out, to full sit-down meals, to even an hour to 90-minute nap before hoofing it back to relieve the other. So now he got to stand like a lump on the room's side wall. In a room so secure entrants had to step into an airlock before passing through. He didn't even bother questioning anymore why they were in a super secure room that in that airlock could detect all manner of communications devices and weapons, along with the room's own active electronics damping field. And the stupid thing was they were only there to do a personnel review that amounted basically to an afternoon attendance call for an intermediate school class. Why they were doing it in a secure room was so asinine he didn't even bother asking. It still irked him, though. Why they didn't have a solid grasp on people was mind-boggling and made his head hurt to consider. Why they needed the head of the hegemony's intelligence section planted firmly in one of those conference room chairs was confusingly bureaucratic. Why she tolerated it was apparent as she stifled a long yawn behind her clenched fists as she leaned forward heavily on her elbows. The reporting agents were more interested in their own notes and arguing points back and forth with each other than watching her. Since Bryce was at her side, he could actually see her jaw drop and deeply pull in the new air, where her hands and arms blocked that view from the rest of the table. He knew for a fact that she'd spent most of her younger life in individually taught and tutored classes. She had never had the opportunity to doze off in the back of a class. She must have perfected that little deception early on in her life, just to escape the prying eyes of the tutors who would have lorded over her in shifts. Bryce refocused his efforts to his own standing discomfort and boredom. There would be absolutely no action in a secure room, inside a secured section of their building, inside a room that cycled everyone in individually and warned every current occupant of a new arrival by a glaring light change over the door. He hitched his H-harness sling higher and back over his shoulders before he leaned back against the backstrap's clasp, pinching it between his back and the wall. He cradled his assault gauss over his right forearm, hooking his thumb behind his belt buckle, while he dropped his left hand to his hip-holstered sidearm. The strap's right back hitch was just perfect for crushing against the wall and massaging out the tension in his upper back from his bruising upper back and shoulder workout that he had just finished before returning to his shift cycle. He happily and quietly rocked back and forth across that semi-painful pressure of the harness just inside his right clavicle where he had focused his workout. He could feel the knot releasing in waves of heat that radiated out and then tingled up and down his spine. He worked slowly side to side as he rubbed his back like a content bear on a stout tree. Bryce could almost feel the knot releasing, and his microscopic nanobots disassembled the released lactic acid as some carted away the waste product, and others zipped into the area with their own proteins to rebuild the cell walls and speed his healing. He was looking forward to his second bruising workout of the day on his chest to balance out the back work he'd just finished less than 3/4 of an hour before. The routine of 2 hours on guard and 2 hours on maintenance was turning into a comforting standard. It did occur to him in that quiet little voice in the back of his brain that he should talk to William about the two of them running a few 4-hour shifts during the week so that they could do things like zip off to the academy building and get in some range time with their weapons. It would be infinitely nice to get behind a high-powered Gauss again, but there were very few ranges in the city that allowed that type of amusement with anything more lethal than a simulator, given the cost of indoor space. A 400-plus meter indoor, multi-lane, live fire range was non-existent outside of the academy ranges. Bryce quietly shifted his harness, pulled, and pressed back against the wall to repeat his massaging exercise with his left shoulder pressed into the harness lump. And there was no way he was going to catch a drop ship from the Citadel to the other side of the planet, so he as a Guardsman captain could put boots onto the ground with a bunch of privates in basic training on their range days. That would send their drill sergeants into conniption fits. Not only would he be lousing up their training rotations by knocking their privates from lanes, but he would be an officer and a Guardsman dropped into their carefully regimented piece of the world far from the city and all other forms of civilization distractions. Bad idea. His eyes fluttered shut as he enjoyed working out a particularly painful knot on his left shoulder, almost stuck up and underneath his left clavicle towards the bottom. He wanted to rumble a contented sigh, just like that bear he envisioned while he was working comfortably. There was, however, no substitute for a live fire, outdoor range, where wind gradients, thermal up and down drafts along the range, and even the uneven fighting position layouts forced the shooter to adapt more fluidly to the changes. Climate-controlled indoor ranges were always the same. Once you'd memorized the variance on each firing position with the climate control circulating and not circulating, you only had to wonder if it would kick on once your round had been fired. That was so boring and predictable that it was not even hard training at all. It was just his duty calm chirped. Bryce jerked alert and upright as his eyes flashed open. He'd neglected to turn it off since the room was shielded. He'd assumed that blocked duty comms too. Apparently, there was a relay hidden somewhere in the room for official communications. Either that or the security screen was deactivated, allowing the call through. The whole room was looking at him, turned in their seats as his device chirped a second time before he could reach it. Even Persephone was staring at him, fully awake, her head to the side, and her lips pinched in annoyance. His comm, like all Guardsman comms, were unlisted and used extra alphanumeric identifiers so they would never be wrong numbers. He pulled it from his pocket quickly, under all the room's scrutiny, and looked at the caller. It was from some number he didn't recognize as it chirped a third time. He felt eyes on him and his own flicked up into the room as Persephone exhaled heavily, shaking her head in severe displeasure. He reluctantly accepted the caller as audio only as Persephone turned back to the meeting and rumbled to her staff heads, "Continue, please." Bryce was pissed off, and it sounded in his voice as he answered curtly, "Identify yourself." He turned into the room's corner, and like a bad child put himself into the corner. He stood with his hand over the receiver so the pickup wouldn't capture as much of the meeting. He could tell by the innocuous use of the bland terms and phrases behind him that they were all now painfully aware of his screw-up. They were saying things like the current slide 3rd column 4th row for that answer, which told him that they were being circumspect with answers just because of his obvious security breach. Uncowed, the voice on the other end of the device spoke calmly. "Guardsman, you will report to the High Commander's office." Bryce snapped. "Like hell, I will. You sanctimonious little prick. Identify yourself immediately." The voice remained calm. "Guardsman, you are blocking video, therefore anything I say is irrelevant because you can't see the office seal. I've already told you to report to the High Commander's office. Therefore, the point of origin should be clear. You have your orders, Captain." Bryce dropped his right hand and white knuckles squeezed the pistol grip of his assault Gauss. "Listen to me, you little bastard. I don't know who you are or where you get these notions in your head, but I'm not going to quit my post." The voice said, "Captain, don't toy with me. There are 2 of you on that detail. I'm sure with your qualifications you can manage to find the other one. Tell him where you are going. Report to the High Commander's office immediately." Bryce was so pissed off his vision was going red at the edges. The only thing that kept him from completely losing his mind was that the jerk on the other side of the comm wasn't using his name or that of his charge. "Go to hell, you little prick." There was an audible sigh on the other side of the connection, causing Bryce to shirk slightly in his corner, confused. He pulled the comm away from his ear to look at it for a second before the other spoke with a careful but cutting tone. "Captain, I'm going to redact some of the commander's following quote, but it should serve as a sufficient notification for you as to the veracity of this call. I quote, 'You tell blank for brains that if he doesn't get his mangy blank over here immediately when you call him.'" Bryce pressed his right hand to his face as his shoulders sank once he recognized who would talk like that. It was not going to be a good conversation with the High Commander, and he knew it. He had not a single clue about what he'd done to earn the ripping. The quote continued, "That I'm going to go down there personally, wrap my hands around his throat, skull-drag his dumb blank up every one of the gods be damned stairs between all the floors between the 2 of us. And then when we get to my office, I'm going to snap his empty head off his neck before reaching up his blank and ripping his blanking spine out from blank to shoulders. Captain, I apologize for the length, but that's somewhat close to the exact quote." Bryce groaned into the corner. Fortunately, it didn't echo off the sound-dampening material that lined the room. "Understood. I'll be there as soon as possible. Can you tell me what this is about?" The crisp's reply was irritatingly precise. "I cannot tell you what this is about. I neither know nor would I repeat something sensitive, be it personal or professional, over an unsecured communications device. I will inform the High Commander that you are coordinating relief and on the way." Bryce grumbled something unintelligible, and with a distasteful look on his face and sour stomach, he pulled the comm from his ear and killed the connection. When he turned and dropped the comm into his pocket, Persephone was just staring at him, eyes demanding an answer. The conversation and updates around the table had stopped cold as she looked away. He walked quietly to her side, leaned over, and spoke softly. "Ma'am, that was the High Commander's office. I'm being called away." Persephone just nodded once. "Make your arrangements with William and be on your way." Disinterestedly, she turned away and directed the meeting back into order. Continue. Bryce stepped back without reason to delay. He sent a quick message to William telling him, "I've been called to the office. I need you back here." The reply came quickly and just as irritated as a simple "on the way." The older guardsman hated breaking into his workouts once he'd started. He'd be pissed when he arrived. There was nothing to do about that now, though. Orders were orders. So he waited. When William arrived, the brick of a man had his uniform straight, but he was still dripping sweat from his workout. He pulled right up into Bryce's face and expressed his displeasure quietly. "Damn it, Captain. This had better be good." Bryce shrugged as best he could, so their assault gauss didn't clatter together in the hushed meeting conversation where the other occupants worked harder to hear the two of them than the meeting content. "I'm just told to report to the High Commander. Nothing else, but he sounds pissed. Don't ask what, though. It beats the hell out of me why, William." William's right boot toe knocked hard into the high firm laces of Bryce's left book, knocking it back and him off balance for a half-second. He growled into Bryce's ear, "I'm a major stupid. I pinned while you were out gallivanting around having all the fun for yourself, and I was laid up in rehab. We're not captains together anymore. Maybe that's why High Commander wants to rip your toenails out, 'cause you're a dumb ass who doesn't pay attention and you keep forgetting simple crap." Stepping back, his tone changed slightly. "Any idea how long you'll be?" Bryce shook his head. "No, sir. I received no word or warning. The orders are just to report." Nodding his acceptance of the indefinite change to their schedule, Major McKinley nodded over his shoulder at the door before quietly dismissing him. "Right. Best not keep the man waiting." Bryce nodded at the dismissal. Once he'd passed through the laborious exit security on the way out of the intelligence section offices, it only took moments for him to reach the secured back corridors through the Citadel. The convoluted security procedures were designed so that those operatives were difficult to pick out of the crowded building as they made their turns up and down corridors past many other offices. All the flow in and out was closely monitored by invisible and unobtrusive security measures he couldn't pick out designed to detect patterns of surveillance following those operatives. Every office leading in was a position of higher and higher trusted responsibility from internal security, auditing all the way around the alphabet to basic accounting. There were no shortcuts or alternate routes. Everything traveled the same way. And so did he, as he trudged off to the High Commander's office. It did nothing for his mood as he wandered around those deliberate concentric circles. By the time he'd finally reached the High Commander's office, he'd burned so much time he didn't even want to think about what awaited his arrival. When he did finally reach the office, he'd never actually been in or around before. The door whisked closed silently behind him as he looked from right to left. He was instantly accosted by the same voice he'd heard on the comm. "It's about time, Guardsman." His eyes snapped to the fellow on the left side of the outer office. The room was spacious and packed with comfortable seating, but empty of visitors other than him. The man behind the desk with the pristine name placard that read Bartholomew Grant continued, "The High Commander has been expecting you." The fellow gestured to his left with a stylus in that hand to the door on that side. He unobtrusively pressed a button to the right of his elevated privacy console with the other hand. "Go straight in. He's waiting for you." Bryce figured he'd deal with the plain little fellow when he finished with this chat. Instead of speaking, he just nodded and stepped briskly to the door. When the door opened, it was like being punched in the face. "Captain, where in the hell have you been all damn day?" Bryce hadn't even stepped past the door's threshold yet, and the High Commander continued yelling at him from his standing position behind the desk. "I told you to report here more than an hour ago." The door was automatically held open while he stood on the threshold, so he stepped inside into the face of the continued bombardment. Of all the half-witted idiots the Academy has produced over all the years, You can't even remember your basic drill and ceremony that has been beaten into your thick skull since you were 5 bloody years old. This was off to a splendid start as Bryce finally halted in front of the closing door, snapped a crisp salute, and barked, "Sir, Captain Mountain reporting as ordered." He heard the final air seal of the door behind him. The High Commander didn't even bother speaking the next command. He just wagged his finger at him, beckoning him to approach the desk. Bryce marched at stiff attention to the front of the desk, snapped his heels together, and braced his assault rifle vertically up over his face in another salute. His salute was instantly returned and dropped by the High Commander. The High Commander turned to his chair, reached down, and with a smooth motion casually flipped a black nylon harness onto the desk in front of him. Bryce recognized the harness instantly as Samson's anti-gravity harness, which meant that whatever he was about to hear was going to suck. Hard because it was risky enough to warrant that extremely dangerous device as insurance. The High Commander pulled 2 envelopes from the ragged stack of mounded paperwork to his own right. He inspected the tiny handwritten pen marks on them and tossed them to Bryce in some order only the High Commander understood as yet. When he spoke, his voice was cool and casual. He carried absolutely none of the heat from his entrance. "Bryce, I need you to get changed into civilian clothes. This is an off-the-books assignment, but a straightforward one. This room was swept for creepy, crawly electronic things as part of routine security this morning. I haven't left, so we should be good. But, pointing at the 2 envelopes, those are your instructions, handwritten and never seen by an electronic eye. They are numbered in the lower left. Open number 1 first, and then number 2. I need you to strip to your skivvies and put on the harness here. I can't have you carrying it around the halls. Someone will get wise." Bryce asked quietly, genuinely confused, "Sir, what in the hell is going on?" Samson just held his silencing finger over his lips. "Everything is in the envelopes." Swiping his finger from the harness to Bryce several times, he continued, "Equipped now, Captain. I checked it myself this morning, but you're relying on it, so check it if you'd like. Harness, change your clothing, leave the Citadel, catch air cabs to escape, and evade at least 3 switches like I taught you. Read and follow the first letter's instructions to completion, and then destroy the first letter. After its destruction, read, memorize, and destroy the second letter. If you're taken, destroy the letters before you preserve your own life. Report back unobtrusively to me only when you're complete with the assignment." That sounded ominous and delivered with the calm ruthlessness that he recognized all too well in his teacher and mentor. The gravity harness meant that the mission was potentially risky enough to consider that highly dangerous method of escape. The personal gravity harness was one of the least safe methods of landing on the ground. The things had a failure rate above 10% for correctly configured devices, manufactured to military standards. Since the High Commander had added the reporting back criteria, it wasn't a suicide mission, just something very important he didn't want shared or spoiled. Complaining would do no good, since it was a lawful order, no matter how odd. Bryce wanted to grouse about putting on what amounted to another man's underwear gravity harness, but since the High Commander was giving Bryce his own equipment that said to him there wasn't time to screw around with either acquiring the parts or manufacture of his own suicide seat. Falling off buildings, through kilometers-deep canyons, clogged with air traffic, at the pull of gravity towards the ground, while relying on stolen, often incompatible parts to slow, repulse, and break your fall from terminal velocity without any of that myriad of mismatched components failing was why they were called suicide seats. Correctly built civilian and bootleg ones failed much more often than the purpose-built ones. There was only about a 70% chance of landing in one piece, if you built the damn thing right in the first place. That was obviously much worse off than the purpose-built military ones. Most people couldn't even manage to build them correctly. They generally made some simple mistake by missing some step like firm full body support, resulting in arms or legs being ripped off before impact as the seat repulsed and wasn't firmly affixed to the full body. The other hazard was being tossed face first into the ground at somewhere around 450 kilometers an hour on this planet because they made a belt instead of a harness. He buttoned his pants, did his belt, and wanted to fuss a little with his uniform top before he left, just because he wasn't looking forward to whatever he was being sent to do. He asked, "Sir, can I stay underarms?" Samson considered for a second before nodding his chin at the assault. "Not with the assault. But you can carry your sidearm concealed." He asked with more than a little professional curiosity, "Sir, you just pulled the same trick CEO Kroinos did getting me out the first time, didn't you?" He looked up from his standing position over the paperwork he'd been signing while Bryce had changed. He spoke calmly, but with a disappointed edge that cut. "Bryce, I like ya, but some days you're so bloody stupid. I don't go to lengths like handwriting instructions in sealed envelopes unless it's important. And you go and say something stupid like that? Yes, the old tricks are often the best tricks. Now that anyone listening knows I know that trick, I can't use it again. You are too damn careless. That is going to cost you some time, and I really don't appreciate that trait of caring for my wife's security. So, get your head out of your third point of contact, Guardsman." Disappointed in his failure to the point where it hurt, he sighed. "Sorry, sir. I didn't think of that." Samson cocked his brow at that obvious understatement. "I'll take care of it. Just don't toss me." Samson sighed and told him flatly, "I'm thinking about drop-kicking you, you blabbermouth." Bryce answered, "Don't, sir. With the harness on, I'll bounce off the floor before I hit it this time." The High Commander cracked a half-smile. "Get out of here and go do your job, Captain." He was still a little dejected when he reached the door, but understood his commander's intent now. Samson shouted after him while it was open, "And don't come back until you've fixed that screw-up, Captain." Bryce was dragged out of the office to his room, like he was actually in trouble again. He changed quickly. Once dressed, he turned off his comm and removed the battery, placing them in separate pockets so no one could hack his comm systems to locate him. Minutes later, he was on his way out the civilian employee checkout to the commuter trams that connected with the building many floors down from his lodging. He rode the trams randomly for over an hour, entered a strange building, dropped many dozens of floors, boarded another set of trams, and repeated the process. He climbed to an upper mid-level air cab dock and then caught one of those to a building address nearly 100 kilometers away. Once there, he dropped all the way down to the residential bowels of the building that were little more than a cubicle slum where nothing worked but sparse lighting. It was a level so low there was zero fresh air circulation. Then he climbed the dangerous stairs up and up and up, where there was no monitoring or security. He climbed until he stepped out into an alien shopping concourse and wandered into and out of stores for nearly 90 minutes. He grabbed an evening meal at some slop house that served burgers and real potato fresh-cut fries, which were actually cut in view of the patrons before being tossed into the fryer. They tasted better than anything he'd tasted in years. He did something he knew was stupid, but the place was too damn good to forget. So he reassembled and powered up his comm, just to save the location address. Then he immediately powered down the comm and disassembled it again. Bryce leaned back in his lonely seat and ripped a quiet but fully relieving belch while stroking his stuffed stomach. as he sighed contentedly. He pulled the first letter out of his back right pocket, unfolded it, and popped the seal with his unused plastic knife. Inside was a building address followed by a cryptic alphanumeric sequence that he recognized as a sequence of directions based on a letter telling him to go up, down, left, right, or straight, followed by a pace count to the next directional marker. There weren't that many directions, but they were fairly long pace counts towards the end. Bryce cringed as he realized he was glad that he'd worn comfortable but sturdy shoes. But it was time for him to be moving along. The meal was welcomed because he'd probably be out all night before he could begin his circuitous journey back. If the numbers were anything resembling accurate, and knowing Samson they were painfully accurate, he'd be walking half the night. That was no exaggeration because the last number was just over 5 kilometers. He had no idea where that number of straight-line steps could be measured in their city. So he caught an air cab to the specified buildings named Tram Stop. Then he began hiking. The security where he landed was pathetically non-existent. He walked right into the building with a Gauss pistol hidden by little more than a loosely buttoned outer shirt. Now the complete lack of hesitation over the assault Gauss made sense, followed by the High Commander's metered acceptance of Bryce's packing a concealed firearm. He must have known this route by heart and rote memorization to have recalled a detail like that. He tried as best he could to blend into the crowd while reading an actual piece of antiquated paper instructions of all things. The insanity of not using his com's various direction programs to find whatever it was he was looking for in their presence made him stand out more than he would have liked. After a while, and entirely too many strange leave the crazy man alone looks from passers-by, he learned to estimate the counts at the very end and lead into the turns. The looks diminished when he started rounding his corners a little more, so he didn't stand out like a soldier on parade in the middle of a staggering pack of drunks. Before long Bryce figured he must have looked like just another one of the hegemony's military corporation troops out on some errand. He stopped worrying about things a little then. That was something he understood. The farther down he twisted into the building the stairwells became more and more treacherous. He ended up by the final descent ending 2 muggings with violent but unfortunately non-lethal force. Bryce really didn't like muggers on a personal level. Something about scum preying on people just rankled him. The first he ended at the middle landing of a stairwell with 3 guys coming up. The lead slammed his hand into Bryce's shoulder without warning and told him to empty his pockets. That didn't go well for him when Bryce slammed his right knee into the guy's thigh just below his squishy groin. As he doubled over, Bryce pulled and lifted his head with his left hand and slammed his right elbow into the side of the guy's head, before pushing him back into his buddies. Both of them stepped clear to the landing sides and let their friend's head slam into the landing's concrete wall. That was before he tumbled past the landing and down the stairs, where he finally slumped unconscious on the landing below. The second was much easier. That one started on the final stair flight into the very bottom floor of that building. That guy just demanded he empty his pockets, while Bryce's hand was already pulling the door open. So he pulled harder and slammed the edge into the guy's face. That instantly dropped him into a bleeding hump as first. His butt slammed heavily into the floor, followed by the rest of him slumping into the filth-mounded corner without a sound. The hardest part about dealing with those muggings was remembering his pace count down the stairs, per his written instructions. That was done in the pause after he'd finished with both incidents. Fortunately, his count took him exactly to the bottom floor, so he figured he'd gotten it right. Bryce stepped into the rancid-smelling corridor. He made the prescribed left and started to hoof his way down the corridor that looked so long that it appeared to narrow into nothing in the distance. If he was looking for an indoor range, he'd found it in this hallway. Of course, the lighting was almost all broken out, and the ventilation consisted of pretty much only the moist, clinging humidity of stale, semi-smoky exhale. The atmosphere was close to the point where the concrete walls practically oozed black slime and the condensation, and its stains clung to everything else. The only fresh air that seemed to arrive was the internal air pressure from the floor that practically whistled past every crack and crevice into upper levels. If not secured and latched correctly, which spotty maintenance didn't allow, the several stairwell doors that he'd passed seemed to breathe with the building. They would periodically gust open slightly before falling back closed again before the next heated exhale of exotic smoke and massed human breath overcame the weight of the door and pushed it open again. It was a disgusting case of physics and meteorology in action. His nanobots were so pissed off at him for taking them there that they were actively punishing him. His eyes and nose were clogged with rancid mucus from the millions upon millions of bacteria, viruses, and spores that they were slaughtering in droves as they tried to enter his body by any means. The chemicals from the various exotic clouds of smoke and recreational chemicals that assaulted his system from various dens he'd passed were processed and discarded the same way as his nanobots would deal with any other hostile chemical warfare attack. Psychotropic drugs of all forms had been used alongside everything from blood to blisters to nerve agents and virulent toxins on the battlefield worlds of incorporated space. High-end military nanoes, like his, knocked them all out before they could damage or degrade his natural systems. That also meant that pain medication didn't work on him either except in massive doses. But if it was bad enough, his nanoes would take care of that too. In the meanwhile, they packaged the chemicals in a sticky tar like goo at the corners of his eyes and in his nose. He reached the end of that leg's pace count, looked around, and only saw the corner and a rigged open emergency hatch with the locking mechanism smashed. He checked his page and found the letter D followed by a single 1, meaning down one flight. Bryce sighed as he realized where this was sending him. He should have brought boots. His feet were going to get dirty. He kicked open the hatch into the building's evacuation ladder, expecting an ambush. Instead, he found the pristinely maintained, thick metal platform with neat stairs down, followed by the over-engineered gantry setup that dropped the stairs all the way to the ground as weight was applied to them. On his way down, he realized that the building was probably obligated by hegemony safety and fire regulations to keep that working as an inspectable item for the building's liability policy and hegemony fire code compliant. He shook his head at the management that checked the block on the bare minimum, while letting the rest of the building go to waste and crime, as long as they paid the rent on time. As he marched down the steadily dropping stairs to the ground, his left hand trailed the handrail on that side, while his right smoothly reached into his top and drew his pistol. He spoke clearly as he dropped the many meters to the ground. "Not my problem. Not my lane. Stay mission-focused, Bryce." The frigid mist created a chilly fog around him as he walked farther and farther into the damp exhale of a whole planet's population, along with all their industry and support systems crowded into one city. He was so far down that the sun never reached the ground. The fog was permanent, and the cold damp was ignorant of weather patterns. They were far enough inland that very few of the planet's infrequent hurricanes would strike their megacity. Even if one did, it would be nowhere near powerful enough to blow out 750,000 square kilometers of fog from under every building in their city center. Bryce reflected on the old joke that a storm that large would scour the surface of the planet clear of buildings before it managed to clear the fog. He stepped off the well-maintained gantry fire escape, and it instantly started to recoil and inexorably lift away. He quickly turned and placed his foot on it to hold his place. He quickly realized that as it pulled free, it must only start downward when pressure started at the top catwalk of the escape's run. It pulled away with a force that shrugged him off as easily as it would have a cockroach. Bryce watched with irritation as the suspended gantry snapped closed into what he realized from the ground was a solid steel cage. The escape stair encased itself like a caterpillar pulling into its own cocoon. The only way back in would have been to have run back up the steps before they retracted and sealed, crushing whoever hadn't reached the suspended catwalk below the escape hatch in time. He was definitely trapped on the ground now. Lesson learned for the next time. He grumbled to himself about figuring out how to get back up into the light and how it was a problem for later. Pistol in hand and more than irritated with himself, he realized he had been wandering around without thinking about the alien dangers of his own world, the simple things that he needed to watch more carefully beyond what people were doing on his normal protection detail duties. It was like being on the battlefield again and looking out for buried mines and other surprises. Bryce walked to the end of the gantry landing, where the stairs had pressed into the mud before retracting. He faced the same direction he had when he stepped off the stairs, with his feet between the muddy imprints left by the ladder. He read his next instruction, turned left, and started his almost 5,000-meter pace count. Where the underworld of their city, not lit by glowing vermin barriers around the massive support legs of every elevated building, and the occasional large light under the buildings, the twilight-gray fog under the buildings would have been totally black. It would have been even darker since it was now long past what should have been sunset anywhere on the planet that had a window or a real job that kept track of things like time. Instead, the fog picked up and diffused all that light into a semi-glowing gray. Bryce buttoned his shirt against the cold as he trudged. He kept the pistol in one hand and the dampening instruction page in the other. He just fixed his eyes on the very distant constellation of faint lights on the horizon in the direction he was supposed to walk and counted every step. He knew he would need to pick out new lights or markers to help maintain his direction. His pace count steadily ticked from 0 at the ladder's landing all the rest of the way up to 5,175 of Samson's fractionally shorter strides.
Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate your listening. When you get a chance, please come and hit the like, subscribe, leave a comment, and check out the book for real down in the description.